Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second shelf and to another recent reads on Sunday, in which I talk about the books that I've read or started, or the books that I'm still working on, those are quite a lot of books. But let's start with the books that I've finished. I finished my first reread of this year. If you follow my channel and maybe you watched my sort of plans and goals 2022, and I really want to put more effort into rereading at least one or two books a month, because when you are on booktube you sometimes get caught up too much in the new books, whether it's backlist books or new releases. That's not so much the point, but that you read something new that you haven't read before, and that is fine. I mean, if that makes you happy, that's perfectly fine. But I missed rereading things that I really liked. So that is one of the plans. And at least in January, I accomplished it. So the first reread was this one, Sylvia Townsend Warner Lolly Willows, first published in 1926. Sylvia Townsend Warner was an English author, and she lived around the turn of the century. And this was her first book, actually, and quite a big success, even though, well, we will get into that a little later, but I will tell you first what it's about. It's about the main character, Laura Willows, who is called Lolly by her niece when her niece was very young and couldn't pronounce Laura, and that sort of nickname stuck to her. And the book opens when Laura is 28 and her father just died, and she is moving in with her older brother and his family. And it's about a woman's life at the beginning of the 20th century, around the First World War, and how constrained the possibilities were. I'm not going to talk about or reveal too much of the plot, because it's quite a thin book, so you have to experience it for yourself. There is a bit of well, let's say devilish stuff in there, which I quite liked. But mainly it is really about a woman at that time trying to find a way to actually live her own life. And when I said earlier that it was a success, the author said, well, it was a success, but she was disappointed by some of the reactions, and she said, well, I made a sword and people just talked about how beautiful the carvings are on the blade. So people didn't quite understand, I would say, that this is actually quite a feminist text. So I love it. If you are interested in a bit of a quirky book with a lot of snarky humor, I can certainly highly recommend this one. And the second book I finished, I'm pretty sure that I read at some point, but probably not in the English translation. So it is kind of a reread, sort of, kind of, and that is Mariama Ba, So Long a Letter, translated from the French by Modope Bode Thomas. Yes. The book was first published in French in 1980, and this English translation in 1989. And I think I read it in German in the 90s, but I'm just not sure anymore. But anyway, it's also quite a short book. Mariama Ba was a Senegalese author. This was also her first book, and she was an educator and an activist for women's rights in Senegal. And she unfortunately died very young, and before she could even finish her first book. She was only 53 or something. So that's real pity, because if this is her debut, the following books I'm sure would have been fabulous. So this is a long letter of our main character, a woman in end of her 40s, beginning of her 50s, who just has been widowed. And she writes this letter to her best friend, recounting, the friend lives in the US, is a translator, so she works for the Senegalese embassy in the US, but is supposed to come back to Senegal. I'm not sure whether it's for a visit or to stay, but they will meet each other again. And as a sort of preparation of this meeting, and because she was just recently widowed, she needs, our main character needs this outlet. So she writes this very long letter to her best friend about the death of her husband, but also about their marriage and the marriage of her best friend. I thought it was really, charming isn't the right word, because it's quite heartbreaking in terms of the position of women in modern Senegal, because it's set in that time, so the 1970s, 1980 maybe. Having to deal with polygamy, with the status of women. It tackles a lot of these issues, but it's all also tenderly wrapped, as it were, in this letter to a really good friend. So I love this book. It's one of my all-time favorites. And I will just count it as my second reread. It's also, by the way, both of these books, I want to point out, are on my 1001 books by and or about women list that I talked about in my plans video. I will leave a link, if I remember, I hope I will remember, leave a link to the Goodreads shelf where I put all these 1001 books by women and about women. My idea is, all these lists, the 1001 books you have to read before you die, they have, if you're lucky, they have maybe a third female authors. And that always bugged me. And so I just decided I'll make my own list. So if you're interested, you can just have a look. Maybe you find inspiration for books to read. Anyway, let's move on. Let's look at my list, the books that I'm still reading. Yes, I'm still reading this one, The Complete Orsinia by Ursula Le Guin, and I'm reading Malafrena together with Adam. I talked about this book in the last recent reads. It's this novel. This part of The Complete Orsinia is a novel, and it is not sci-fi. It's often designated to be fantasy, but I wouldn't say that. It's kind of historical fiction in a made-up country, but it's set in around 1815, after Napoleon was exiled and Austria was one of the main powers in Europe, and then you have this made-up country, Orsinia, but a lot of the events and the atmosphere are historical. It's not going to be my favorite, spoiler alert, it's not going to be my favorite Le Guin, but for me it's interesting because I'm making my way through Le Guin's work together with Adam, and if you are a Le Guin completist, this is really a good, it gives you a good insight into the author's mind, how it worked, because it was one of the first books that she wrote, not the first book that was published, but one of the first books that she wrote. What else? I'm also still working on this one, Maria Tatar, the heroine with 1001, here you have it again, 1001 Faces. Again, I talked about this book. It's an answer to Joseph Campbell's book about the male hero, which was published in 1949. This one is a new release from last year, and the author explores the female heroine. And then there's one more book I have to look at my list because I'm still working. Oh yeah, of course, because I didn't make that much progress in that book. And that is Rachel Carson's essay from 1951, The Sea Around Us. I think I read like 5 pages or maybe 10 pages. So I'm sure I will love it because I loved her previous book, Under the Sea Wind, which is the first book in this sort of trilogy about life in and around the ocean. But it's too early to tell with 5 or 10 pages. And then we get to the books that I've just started. Let me see. There is this one, finally, Louisa Edric, The Sentence, which was published last year in November. And if you follow my channel, you might remember that I just couldn't get a copy. I had in 2020, my author spotlight was Louisa Edric. As you know, I do an author spotlight each year, which means I focus on one author to read all their work, novels mainly, and essays, not so much into plays, in chronological order. And of course, I pick an author, that is manageable, not Joyce Carol Oates with like 1,328 books published each year. So Louisa Edric had 16 novels that seemed manageable, and I did that together with Terry from Miss Terry Reads, and we finished last year. So it took us a little longer than a year. We finished in April last year with The Night Watchman, and then of course in November Edric's newest book came out, and we decided to just carry on, as it were, with our Author Spotlight 2020. And then I couldn't get the book. I have no idea why. It was just not possible, not even through Amazon. And finally, in December, I got this through a used bookstore in Germany, and we finally started. So this is like, I don't know, 3 minutes telling you the history of this book, which you're probably not even interested. Anyway, so this is I'm just 1/3 or something. So it's the main character Tuki, who has been in prison for a crime that will be explained in the first chapter of the book, and she is released much earlier than she expected, and she read a lot in prison, and then she starts to work. After her release, she starts to work for a tiny bookstore. And in that bookstore, there's this customer, Flora, an elderly woman who dies and then haunts, quote unquote, the bookstore as a ghost. So that's the central setting. And that's all I'm gonna reveal for now. I loved the first part. I thought it was really, again, that kind of quirkiness, playing with ghosts and playing with, the quirkiness of human beings, but still tackling really serious issues. Because as in a lot of her books, she talks about indigenous people, and not only about people as such, the characters, but the history of the indigenous people in the United States and the hardship that they had to endure and still have to endure. So it's a serious topic, but she sprinkles this kind of ghostly humor into it. I love that. And the other book that I started, we stick with the ghost theme, as it were, is this one, Yumiri Tokyo Ueno Station. And I forgot the translator's name, I'm sorry. Translated from the Japanese by Morgan Giles, Giles, published in Japanese in 2014 and in the English translation in 2020. This was a Christmas gift from a friend of mine, and it had been on my list to read, and it's also on the 1001 books by women list. And I think I read maybe 10 or 20 pages, but it's huge font, so it's also too early to tell. But you have Ueno Station is a real station. That's what I learned also from Shawn, who, by the way, didn't like the book that much, but which is a pity. But anyway, Ueno Station is a station in Tokyo, and there is the book is set around this station where there are a lot of homeless people living in tents. And our main character was born in the 1930s, and he is also living there, but he's dead. He's a ghost. So that's why we stick with the ghost theme. And then we learn about his history and his life and the connection that he has with Japanese history. Like I said, Shawn read it already. If you want to check out his review, I will leave a link to his channel down below. I think it was in his last Friday Reads, no, the one before last, that he talked about the book. And like I said, it was not his. It was just not his cup of tea. So I hope that I have more luck with this one. Anyway, so these were the books that I finished, the books that I'm still working on, and the books that I started for this recent reads on Sunday. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, I'm all caught up with the comments. So the year is now 2 weeks old, a little more than 2 weeks old, and so far, yeah, me. I'm looking forward. I'm saying this because the next sentence is always, I'm looking forward to your comments, and I really try my best to answer them, in a more speedy fashion than last year. And I'll see you all soon in the next one.